there. I'm Carly Stevenson. I work upstairs at the Urban Design Center. This is my colleague Allison, and she and I have been organizing the UDC talks this year. The Urban Design Center has been doing this series for many years now with the goal of reaching out to the general public and our design community and bringing experts that are doing innovative projects in the area, as well as bringing outside experts who are experiencing things that we may be experiencing in a few years. This year we have narrowed down the topic even a little bit more, and we're focusing on how we communicate as designers. So thinking about how important it is to make our design process and our decision-making process clear from the beginning, so that the value that we're providing with our proposed designs when we're selling them is invaluable. So I'm going to hand it over to Allison, and she's going to introduce our speaker for today.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. Today we are welcoming Dan Parham. He's a product designer, formerly a director of user experience at Yahoo. Feel free to fact check me anytime, Dan. Leading product design and research for Yahoo Autos and Real Estate. He's currently leading product design and operations for his company Neighborland, of which he is a co-founder. Neighborland is a communications and engagement platform that empowers organizations to collaborate with their stakeholders in an accessible, participatory, and equitable way. Neighborland has worked with over 200 civic organizations, and over 1 million U.S. residents have participated in Neighborland projects to date. He's here today to speak about a methodology called community-centered design, which helps engage residents in the planning of their community, of which Neighborland is a part. And he is currently using Neighborland, as is the city of Raleigh, to assist in the design of Dorothea Dix Park, which we've all known about, and he has already seen about 5,000 responses from the community. So to correct me on any of that and elaborate a little bit, we have Dan today.
Thank you. I started Neighborland in 2011 with an urban designer, Candy Chang. Many people know her from her project Before I Die. And Neighborland is based on another one of her projects called I Wish This Was. And my brother, T. Parham. So T leads engineering for us. We have a small team of engineers based in Boulder, Colorado, and we have a distributed team. So Neighborland is a social enterprise with folks in New York, San Francisco, Boulder, and now here in Raleigh. And our mission is to empower people to shape the development of their neighborhoods. And the way that we do that is we make it easier for city agencies to communicate and collaborate with the public. So we've worked with about 200 organizations, and what's interesting about this group is these are all civic organizations. So whether we primarily work with the planning departments in cities, that's our primary partner, but we also work with transportation authorities, housing authorities. We're working with Dorothea Dix Park Conservancy in Raleigh Parks here, working with a library in Toronto. Sidewalk Labs, interesting new company. We've done corporate social responsibility for companies like Google and Microsoft, Spotify, and Twitter. Physical and institutional planning for folks like UC Berkeley and University of North Carolina. And I always want to share that we've had a lot of support from foundations throughout the history of the organization. A lot of times the city wants to do things in an innovative way, but it's not in the budget. So how do you actually solve that problem? And that's where folks like the Knight Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Obama Foundation, they can step in and fund a more innovative approach to planning. So I deeply appreciate their support. So what is Neighborland? It is a communications platform. It's a set of tools that essentially, what it helps people like Raleigh Parks do, it helps them model their participatory processes, the exercises that they're running at the public meetings. It helps them do that online, right? So that's the tool. And it's important to say, this is a picture from this, I think it was the second big community meeting over at the Opera House. There's how many people were there? Right. The conversation was pretty rich. It was a pretty amazing opportunity to meet folks from the Michael Van Valkenburg design team and staff from City, and the conversation was incredibly rich. And one of the things that I learned in the early days at Neighborland was, where does that go? Where does that conversation go? So yes, it goes into our minds, all of us that were there, but how about the people that weren't there? How do we remediate that conversation? How do we model that conversation online so the folks that can't make it to the community meetings can participate? So it's really important that we build technology that allows our partners to upload that data. And I saw Caroline, and I wanted to say, I wanted to shout out the Caroline and Nicole on this engagement at Letterland a few weeks ago. So we're starting to work with Wake County Public Schools on engagement, and there were some really cool ideas that came out of the initial conversations. And one of the things that Wake County Public Schools told us was there's this event at Pullen Park called Letterland, and people wait in line before they can do the activity, and it's an incredible place to meet people where they are. And so this is, when we talk about communications for planning departments and urban design departments, this idea of getting out into the community and meeting folks where they are, it's an important concept with this is to fish where the fish are swimming. Right? So like there's lots of folks that are going to be at Letterland, so take a lightweight mobile whiteboard that asks people what they would like to see at Dix Park and put it there and allow them to participate and have a conversation and learn more about the project where they are. So our purpose is to help civic organizations and people collaborate more effectively. We've actually had 3 million people participate, and there's over 5 million insights in the tool. And the most important thing is the impact that we help our partners achieve. So this idea of $3 billion, where that comes from is those are projects that have been delivered. It's the architecture, engineering, and construction cost of projects that have been delivered that we supported. I think it's important to zoom out for a second and start with why. So we're seeing this incredible in-migration to Raleigh right now. It really is the big challenge that's at the top of everyone's mind. Like, how are we going to deal with the growth of the city? But it's not just happening here. It's happening all over the planet. So by 2050, 7.5 billion people will live in cities. 75% of people on the planet, generating 90% of the gross economic output of the planet. $75 trillion will be spent in the next 10 years on urban infrastructure globally. You don't see a double-digit trillion-dollar number very often. And this is from Michael Berkowitz at 100 Resilient Cities. He had worked with some large banks in America to come up with this number. That's a lot of resources. Who decides how we invest those resources? In every city. In Raleigh. Who decides? How do we decide? That's the point of community-centered design. So where we come from is a mix of participatory planning theory, human-centered design, and open source software. Everybody's got to have a Venn diagram. Here's our Venn diagram. And for those of you in the room that aren't familiar with participatory planning theory, this piece of theory is what really resonates for me. It's Sherry Arnstein's ladder of civic participation. And so the idea is, how do decision makers communicate with the public? So this is the very bottom of the ladder. This is when we are lied to. It's manipulation, right? Therapy. This is interesting how low informing is on the ladder. And here's an interesting one, placation. We want to hear your ideas and do nothing about it, right? What we're doing with Raleigh Parks is we're here. Right? We might actually even stretch into this a little bit in terms of the partnership with the working groups. It's very exciting. So if you wanted, that is a great piece of, it's only 3 pages. It's incredible. And I distill it to this, this is our North Star at Neighborland. Public participation must be broad-based, inclusive, and representative. So I'm going to talk a little bit about human-centered design from my experience as a director of user experience at Yahoo. So what were we doing? We were using human-centered design techniques, a lot of which come from urban planning and theory. We were using those to design software for hundreds of millions of people. And our methodology was pretty simple. I worked really closely with Larry Tesler, who was the head of design. He was one of the original designers at Apple. He invented things like the menu bar at the top of the Apple operating system that we still use today, and cut and paste. Very interesting, like how did he come up with that interface, the Lisa interface? And it was through this method, this human-centered design method. Listen, observe people, sketch, prototype, measure, iterate, build. And so after I left the technology sector and came into more working in the public sector, this big idea that I had was, what if we applied some of these methods to urban design? And it's kind of silly because it's just a circle, right? It's sort of these techniques were really designed in the urban planning practice, and then they were applied to technology, and now we're bringing them back. Technology does move fast though, and that there's a lot of learning in that, and so I wanted to see if we could apply some of the best practices to urban design. So this is a project that we did with San Francisco Planning. The neighborhood is the Dog Patch. It's basically a maritime industrial neighborhood on the eastern edge, and it's rapidly changing. So its population is predicted to 4x in the next 10 years. So 10x. Really intense pressure. Lots of really cool development going on. And that's bringing, because of the laws in San Francisco, that's bringing capital into the general ledger that can be spent on public space improvements. So this plan is the public realm plan. It's how do we improve parks, streets, open spaces, etc. And this project was run by Robin Abad, and David Fletcher was the landscape architect that led this. And so we really, where we plugged in is really helping them online. So let's take that process of build, measure, learn and apply it. So first of all, like who lives in the Dog Patch? Lots of data. Let's really set a scene for how we're going to engage with them. So, you know, this timeline is important because what it is it's a cycle of meeting people in person, uploading that data, responding to the input that you get. That's the iteration piece. It's really co-designing. So that's pretty exciting. This idea that you could show up. In the Dog Patch, there aren't any civic institutions. There's no schools. There's no churches. It's an industrial neighborhood. So the only places to meet are in places like a brewery, right? And so the planning team, this is Neil Rashali from SF Planning, and the planning team pops up different solutions for the public space and then takes feedback there. So it's a little hard to see, but basically what you're seeing is different types of maps, you know, open spaces, parks, streets, sidewalks, and folks are dot voting and commenting. So what's important is we are uploading all of that. It's really, really important, right? Because at the meetings, here's an example of improving Islas Creek. Jarke Ingalls is now working on this project as part of Resilient by Design. And what you can see here on the software is just like a really simple map of pins and polygons of all the opportunities, and we did segmentation surveys for them so that they could understand what was the difference between what people who lived in the Dog Patch wanted versus people who worked there, people who visited there. This is kind of a fun exercise where you can imagine like a big table where you have 4 or 5 people on each side with a big, these are like map sections. And you have like residents on either side of the map writing, talking, discussing. I mean, it was amazing to see folks in the neighborhood get down to where they were almost discussing every square foot of the street. Right? Like the gentleman who owned the brewery, like he's very aware of all of the issues right in front of his brewery, right? And can speak extremely intelligently about that. It's important that we capture that data. So this is an interesting slide from the plan, and for the planners in the room, this plan is publicly posted now. It's the Central Waterfront Public Realm Plan. But this is an interesting technique here of basically creating a stack graph of what's most important based on input, in-person feedback, Neighborland, and other surveys. And so the one park in the neighborhood is obviously the most important public space, but there's also right out on the water, there's a little park that could be could use a lot of work. And then there was this idea of Tunnel Top Park. So Tunnel Top Park, there's a there's heavy rail that runs through the neighborhood, and on top of the tunnel, there's nothing there, right? It's essentially just cement and is chain linked up. And there's like this wonderful opportunity to activate it. And so when we think about human-centered design, one of the techniques is how can we get going quickly, roll up our sleeves and experiment, and get data from that process. And so what the planning department wanted to do was get residents into that space very quickly and start stewarding the space. And then the planning department was able to very quickly get permits through because of their relationship with Caltrain and actually build a park. So the first step was really just to create a flat area, a multi-purpose space, and then support all of the plantings that had been done, the more tactical urbanism, grassroots work from the community. So in some ways this picture is it's an image of grassroots and grass tops. And then iterate, right? Like what kind of seating should we put in that space? This is working with the local design school on seating options for the space. And then, of course, this is just one project of many in this neighborhood. So things like the Dog Patch Arts Plaza was another really interesting outcome of the project. And so as you look at each of the parks, each of the open spaces, each of the streets, you just repeat the process. So now what you have is the design team, they're out on a tour looking at all of the parks that SF Parks has done in the last 10 years, and they're looking at all the design elements and evaluating, well, what's actually worked? What hasn't worked? And so they're on they're back into that learning phase, right? Because human-centered design is cyclical. This is pretty fun for me. This is the first time I was in a plan. So anyway, I encourage the planners to check it out. So why do it? What do you actually get out of taking this approach? It's collaboration is this word that sounds really nice. It's a nice sounding word, but collaboration is hard. It takes longer time. There's sharing of power in that process for the city, for the residents, for the developers. It's difficult, right? But it leads to better outcomes. That's what I learned working in the tech sector. The reason that Google invests in human-centered design is not because it feels good. It's because it works. So usability, you get better products. If you sort of think of a park as a product, right? If we're doing that, then you'll get a better park if you take this approach. There's also dividends to taking this approach. You build trust with the community. You even might build capacity within the community to understand the planning process, to understand what it takes to program a park, for example. But most importantly, you build legitimate buy-in. So this is something I always say. You can't buy buy-in. You have to build it. Talk a little bit about technology. This is a case study from Atlanta. This is the old Braves Stadium. It's a 67-acre park downtown. It's where the stadium is with a parking lot around it. And today, it's basically just a parking lot. And so the city owns the land. Rec and Park in Atlanta own the land, and they're going to sell the land to have it be redeveloped. And it's an incredible opportunity. It's 67 acres in downtown Atlanta. And so before the architecture process started, the councilwoman in this district really fought hard to run a highly participatory process. And she was able to find funds from Invest Atlanta, which is like it's like a CBD in Atlanta, the Annie Casey Foundation, and then Atlanta Planning. They contributed staff time, right? So that's sort of like where did the resources come from? And so then they hired experts like Perkins and Will and Neighborland to come in and help on the project. And it was really important that we make this project as accessible as possible. There's a lot of folks that live in the neighborhoods around the site who couldn't make it to the public meetings. So we needed to make sure that what we were doing at the public meetings was represented online. It's one thing that we do at Neighborland, a service that we provide, is we kind of like help planners de-wonkify their language. So it's really hard. Planning is actually really hard. It's really complex, right? And when you're a planner, you're sort of like, it's a very difficult, it's from a communications perspective, it's a very difficult position to be in, because on the one hand, you're discussing with city leaders like all of this extremely complex problem, and then on the other hand, you're trying to communicate with communities, some of whom are just finding out about the project today, right? Some people who are like deeply in the process. So we help planners sort of humanize their language, and we do that in the interface design itself, right? There's constraints in the interface so that you have to ask this question of like, what do you want to see at Turner Field? You have to be able to like ask it in 200 characters. So folks, share their ideas. In this case, the planning department also seeded a lot of ideas that had been in the community for generations. So a lot of times neighborhoods, especially in neighborhoods that are changing fast, they have planning fatigue because they've been going to meetings for years and years, and they feel like the city's reached out to them, God knows how many times, and they're saying the same thing over and over again. So it's important that we give city agencies the opportunity to seed ideas that have existed in the community. And here we are, the same process again, right? That what's going on in the meetings, meeting people in public space. This was at Atlanta Streets Alive, a big map of the site put out for their open streets there, sharing information, collecting ideas, putting it all in one database. That's extremely important. We're doing this with Dix Park, all the data from the workshops, the comments that come in online, we're putting them into one database. We can map that data. It's very exciting. And this idea of like, giving residents the ability to discuss solutions and problems. That allows the city staff, they don't have to actively participate in every discussion. It's important that we allow neighbor-to-neighbor, peer-to-peer discussion. That's really important. So Neighborland provides that. We basically provide a very lightweight, project-specific forum, is what we're doing from a technology perspective. Atlanta did a really, great work engaging public school folks. And this is important that we had the anonymous configuration, the digital kiosk configuration to do that. And so then all of that data informed the big concepts. And then those, and this is some work actually from Kimley Horn in Perkins and Will. So Kimley Horn was working on the transportation planning. And so this idea of once you ask people, what do you want to see on the street? And then they tell you, you take that, as a designer, you deal with all the actual constraints around what's possible. Then you push that back out into the community and say, hey, here are your scenarios. Here's the street as it is today. Here's light rail running down the middle ground. Here's light rail and protected bike lanes paired together. And you can you can help residents understand how much these things cost. And then you can create a data metric of a data grid of all the benefits, right? You can say, okay, how do we evaluate which one of these is the best approach? They also did really interesting modeling exercises. They were helping residents understand that on the 65-acre site, which today is a parking lot, that if you have a certain amount of development and height in the building, that gives you all kinds of opportunity for public benefit, right? But you've got to go up to generate enough money to have beautiful multi-use recreation fields that have the lights on every night, because that costs money. So like helping people really understand what it takes to create a neighborhood together. Of course, we measure everything very closely for our partners. This is a hard slide for people to see, but I threw it in here because it's brand new on the tool. When you look at those scenarios, and folks go in and they comment and they reply to one another about what it is that they think was working or not working about the design, we can now use natural language processing, machine learning, to analyze all those comments so that the facilitator doesn't actually have to read all of them to get a sense of sentiment. Now, of course, most of our teams do read all of the comments, the planning teams do, but this does help just kind of give you a basic thumbs up, thumbs down on comments. So then, we saw the sort of hand sketched concepts before. Now you're getting into like high fidelity, like this is the actual neighborhood, right? This is the stadium. This is the $20 billion of development that we're going to see over the next 10 years, right? Take comments on it. Run that process through again. See what people have to say. Use machine learning to analyze that conversation at scale. And so for the planners in the room, I encourage you to check out, it's called the LCI plan. So, obvious question, like, is community-centered design scalable? Here's a project that we did in Mountain View with the Knight Foundation, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, Google as a partner. They are based in Mountain View, California. And they asked folks, what did they want to see? And it's really interesting. In this slide, it actually says, remove Google right there. Right? It's very, very open, like real conversation, right? When this picture was taken, I took this picture. When I was standing there, right to my left, Google had two folks from their real estate team clicking all of the behavior around who's just reading the content, who's writing the content, who's voting on the content, right? So that's that kind of interaction. Like you can measure it. We measured that, and the outcome from that was that Mountain View is not a safe place to walk or a safe place to ride a bike. Now, affordable housing is also a big issue, which that was the sort of, but there was like an urgency around that. And so Google actually sponsored, this is where you have a non-government organization helping the government. They sponsored a planner, paid a salary for a planner to join the city's team, and they hired Alta to do the first bike plan for Silicon Valley. There was a guy from field operations who said recently, the worst thing that Silicon Valley does is urbanism. Think about it. A place where all of this technology that we use every day comes from, there wasn't a bike lane in their communities. So the first protected bike lane in Silicon Valley came out of this work. New Orleans, very different context. This is talking about transportation issues downriver, and this idea of having a dignified ride downriver. Why can you take the streetcar up St. Charles, uptown, but you can't take a streetcar downriver? And that's just like a very obvious, it's like a really good question for folks to ask about New Orleans and equity and transportation. And when we opened up Neighborland in New Orleans, this idea of the streetcar going to Poland Avenue was the most popular idea by far. It was also a $100 million idea. It's like a hard one to actually execute on, right? There's some big ideas on Neighborland. There's some bad ideas. There's some great ideas. This one, a local blogger called us Neighborland of Pipe Dreams. Why are you working on this project? People have been working on this for 10 years. It's never going to happen. And Neighborland didn't make it happen. Rachel Helligman from the transportation advocacy organization called Ride NOLA, and Van Joins from the Bywater Neighborhood Association, and Councilwoman Kristen Palmer, they, working with the residents, they made it happen. And then the mayor got in the picture. He got at the front of that parade and cut the ribbon, right? But it is a $90 million streetcar and complete street and increase in bus routes. So it's not just a streetcar. So Resilient by Design is a design competition about how to make the Bay Area more prepared for shocks and stresses like climate change and earthquakes and so forth. So the Rockefeller Foundation put together, they essentially had a contest, and they had 10 interdisciplinary design teams that generated solutions for how to prepare the Bay Area for what's coming in the next 50 years. And so to do that, we needed to build a new tool called Scenarios, where they could post all of that information and collect comments on that information. And for the planners in the room, I highly encourage you to check this project out, because you've got the world's best engineers, designers, architects, advocates, it's just academics, economists. Like each team had like 25 people, including city staff. And there's 10 proposals. And if you only look at one, look at the big sponge from field operations. Incredible. Does it scale? What about if we use Neighborland to plan the budget? So Mesa, Arizona, which is a similar size to Raleigh, it's about 480,000 people. They had a new mayor, John Giles, who sort of ran his campaign on, I want to hear from you. I want the city council, we don't have all the best ideas in the room. We need to hear from our community. And so he ran this project called Imagine Mesa, and they went out, engaged, did all the things I've been talking about, and they had 67,000 people participate. That's 13% of population on their $1 billion capital plan. So it's not on their like operational budget, it's on their capital improvement budget. And this, I put this image in because this is actually where the rubber meets the road. Most of my images are really beautiful design images and incredible drawings and all of that. But here are your decision makers actually deciding on how the budget's going to be spent. And so what we were able to do, you know what's cool about this? They all have a tablet in front of them. And they're all able to pull up Imagine Mesa and look at the data and all the reports that we helped provide. Does it scale is the question, right? In San Francisco, we've run 15 projects. Well, in aggregate, the city's engaged over 100,000 residents, 12% of population. So some of the things that we've learned along the way, how do you make sure that this process is successful? So this is just a little checklist. Sorry for folks that can't see it. Really, this checklist could have one item on it. Define the problem and establish your success metric. 90% of the conversation that we have when we start projects is around those two things. What exactly do you want from the public? Do you want to placate the public? Do you want to empower the public? Like where are you exactly with your strategy? What kind of resources do you have? What kind of timeline? But it all comes from problem definition. Because there's not a lot of money for public engagement. Right? It's not where, if you think about it, what we've seen across 200 projects, if you take the total budget, 1% is spent on planning and 1% of that is spent on public engagement. That's why we tend to work on projects of a big scale. And if you think about measuring your success metric and you say, well, what is it that we actually want to learn from the community and how would we measure that? And then we define that, what our success metric is. And then we look at our total budget in terms of our time and our resources, and we think of that as return on engagement. And we basically see across our projects that it costs about $1 a person to engage. What's interesting is, well, the question of like, well, what do other techniques cost? It costs $50. It costs the city almost $50 per person at a public meeting. So this is some data from the Metro Nashville Planning Commission, but it rings true with ours as well. The other thing that we've learned from San Francisco and Mesa and Atlanta is that what our partners in the city, what they really want is they want to own it. They don't want to license Neighborland. It's a little tricky in terms of from a business perspective. Even though we have public sector values, we don't run advertising and we don't sell data to third parties. So we don't have any of these issues that Facebook has with Cambridge Analytica, right? Like in the way that we intentionally designed our tool, we don't have those issues. Still, the city really wants to, they want to control and manage the relationship with their community. And so we've started to think about what would it look like if we did citywide work where every project, Avent Corridor, Dix Park, downtown Raleigh, every plan, what would that look like? Could we actually, is there a value in doing it at a citywide scale? So any department can use it and they don't have to allocate money because the city has a license, like a citywide license. So the department doesn't have to like find the money for public engagement technology. Like unlimited projects. right? You can, as a city, you can be as radically inclusive as you want and engage on every project. We could build features for our CACs here, for example. Like there's a little bit of like custom engineering and design work that we would need to give a tool to the CACs that work for them. And if we unified all the analytics and reporting and data and we had it city branded and there was single sign-on for residents, what would that look like? So like internally at Neighborland, that's what we're talking about. Dorothea Dix Park, what an incredible opportunity. It's been it's so much fun for me to be able to participate in projects. I don't get to participate in the Turner Field redevelopment in Atlanta or Dog Patch in San Francisco. So to have a project here where I'm rooted, that I'm connected to, it helps me like gut check our software and make sure that it's working well. We have a really strategic partnership with Raleigh Parks. They're giving us a lot of feedback on what's working with the tool, what could be better. And it's a park that I can bike to. I live in downtown Raleigh and ride my bike through the park 3 or 4 times a week. So the idea that I, myself, can help shape the development of this place, it really it helps me with my work across the country. So how many people have participated? Thank you. It's awesome. And we've done this, we're wrapping up the ideation phase, right? So there's been a lot of ideas posted on Neighborlands and comments, and we've tried to cluster and make sense of all that data. And we've had 6,500 people participate and 3,500 insights, over 500 hours of time on site. Like we've had 500 hours of collective engagement, which is exciting. Folks from 70 counties in New York, 42 US states, 30 countries. This is an international project that people are paying attention to. And there's lots of insights from the data. And where we're going now is we're gonna shift into taking your feedback on Michael Van Valkenburg and Raleigh Parks on the concepts themselves. So we're shifting out of ideation and we're gonna actually move into like hearing your feedback on the Rocky Branch redesign, the Big Loop, the Super Meadow, some of the strategies around the buildings and how we're going to adaptively reuse those buildings, right? We want to hear from you and we want to hear from your neighbors. So join us. Neighborland, Dix Park, or dixpark.com, dixpark.org/ideas. Easy to find. And I'll leave you with this quote from our co-founder.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.